Welcome to today's deep dive. May God grant a divine blessing upon your day today, and may He bring profound divine blessings to your upcoming week.
Thank you. And yes, welcome everyone. We're really thrilled you're joining us today.
We really are, because today we are pulling apart what you might call Jesus's radical, entirely countercultural blueprint for community life.
It really is radical.
It is, and we are drawing from some incredibly rich sources for this. We have detailed notes from the Holman Study Bible and also the Nova Almeida Actualizada, or the NAA Study Bible, and we're specifically focusing on Matthew chapter 18.
Right.
And to help ground all of this and how a community actually functions in the real world, we are also looking at a deeply compelling theological essay on church discipline by Mark Dever.
Which is such an important piece of the puzzle. To set the stage for you, Matthew 18 is the fourth of Jesus's 5 major discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. At this point in the historical narrative, his earthly ministry is, well, it is approaching its final stages.
Yeah, the clock is ticking.
Exactly. And he is spending a considerable amount of time explaining the specific characteristics of this new covenant community. He's laying down the architectural framework, essentially, for how his disciples are supposed to relate to one another.
Okay, let's unpack this framework, because if you look closely at the text, these ground rules are incredibly disruptive to human nature.
Oh, completely.
The chapter actually kicks off with a very recognizable human flaw, which is the disciples' pride. They approach Jesus and they ask, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?
They want a ranking system.
Right. They are essentially looking for the corporate ladder of this new kingdom. They want to know who gets the corner office.
And it reveals a complete misunderstanding of what greatness actually is. I mean, they are operating on the assumption that status is based on effort or achievement and human hierarchy. So Jesus responds by giving them a living object lesson. He calls a little child over and places the child right in the middle of this group of ambitious, status-hungry men.
I want to pause there, because when modern readers see Jesus use a child as an example, the immediate assumption is that he is talking about innocence. We think of children as, pure or naive. But looking at the NAA study notes, that doesn't seem to be the primary point Jesus is making here at all, is it?
Not at all. The ancient world viewed children very differently than we do today. It wasn't about innocence or cuteness. It was about extreme vulnerability and a complete lack of social standing.
They had zero power.
Zero. A child in the first century was entirely reliant on a parent for direction, protection, resources. They had a total inability to advance their own station in life.
So by placing the child in the center of the room, he is directly targeting their ambition.
He is issuing a stark rebuke. He is telling these grown men that unless they humble themselves and become entirely dependent, incapable of advancing their own spiritual status without the Father, they won't even enter the kingdom, let alone be the greatest in it.
It is the ultimate upside-down kingdom. The way up is actually all the way down. And from that beautiful, albeit challenging picture of a child, Jesus pivots to one of the most severe warnings in the entire biblical text.
It is a harsh shift.
Very harsh. He addresses the danger of causing one of these little ones to stumble. And the notes clarify that little ones here refers to these new, humble, spiritually vulnerable believers. Jesus states it would be better for you to have a millstone hung around your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea.
The imagery is intentionally visceral. It is meant to absolutely shock the listener.
And the Holman study notes add a layer of historical context that makes it even more terrifying. When we hear millstone, we might picture a heavy rock used by hand to grind grain in a kitchen. But the specific Greek word used here refers to a massive industrial-sized stone that was so incredibly large and heavy it had to be turned by a donkey.
When you pair the crushing weight of that specific stone with the imagery of the sea, the horror multiplies for the original audience. You have to remember, ancient Israel was not a seafaring nation.
Right, they weren't sailors.
No, in their cultural and literary imagination, the deep sea represented utter chaos, destruction, the abyss. Drowning in the depths of the sea was a uniquely horrifying nightmare concept for a first-century Jew.
Jesus is essentially saying that experiencing your absolute worst nightmare is vastly preferable to the spiritual reality of leading a vulnerable believer into sin. That level of protectiveness over the community is staggering.
It is a fierce protectiveness, which contextualizes the next startling statement he makes. He tells his followers that if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. If your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out.
Which, again, requires some careful reading. The NAA notes are quick to point out that this is intentional hyperbole. He is not promoting literal self-mutilation.
He is demanding rigorous, uncompromising self-discipline. By using such extreme exaggeration, the text emphasizes that sin operates like a deadly infection in the community. You have to remove the radical cause of sin from your life before it destroys you completely. The alternative he presents is being thrown into the fire of hell.
And the sources provide some fascinating historical geography on that word, hell. The Greek word used in the text is Gehenna.
Yes, Gehenna is derived from the Valley of Hinnom, which was a literal geographic location just outside the walls of Jerusalem. By the 1st century, this valley had been repurposed into the city's burning garbage dump. Refuse, waste, and the bodies of criminals were constantly being burned there. The fires were kept going day and night.
So when Jesus uses the word Gehenna, he isn't just speaking abstractly. He is giving his listeners a sensory, real-world metaphor for divine judgment. They could likely step outside the city walls and smell the smoke of Gehenna.
It grounds the theological warning in a physical reality they interacted with daily. It makes the need for radical spiritual amputation, cutting off the behaviors that lead to destruction, feel incredibly urgent.
This intense focus on protecting the vulnerable naturally raises a difficult question for you to consider. What happens when someone in the community does stumble? What happens when one of the sheep wanders off despite all these warnings? Jesus addresses this by telling the parable of the shepherd who leaves the 99 sheep on the mountain to go search for the one that went astray. And tucked right before that parable is this mind-bending detail. Jesus says not to despise these little ones because their angels in heaven continually see the face of the Father.
It is a staggering theological detail. The Holman notes suggest that these guardian angels assigned to protect vulnerable believers have unimpeded access to the heavenly throne. They are incessantly in the presence of God the Father, advocating for the needs of these disciples.
It paints a picture of a God who is deeply, actively invested in the rescue of his people. But that brings us to the hardest part of any rescue mission, which is dealing with someone who refuses to be rescued. This is where Mark Dever's essay on church discipline becomes a crucial lens for understanding this text. Because let's be honest, the phrase church discipline sounds archaic to modern ears. It can evoke images of a harsh, puritanical trial.
It is a concept that makes modern readers very uncomfortable. But Dever makes a compelling argument that biblical church discipline, when executed correctly, is actually an act of profound love. He helps clarify this by distinguishing between two categories of discipline. First, there's formative discipline.
Formative discipline being the everyday preventative care of the community.
Exactly. It is the positive teaching of biblical truth, the sermons, the study groups, the molding of character through shared life. It is the daily diet and exercise of the community. If formative discipline is healthy, it prevents a lot of wandering.
But Dever's second category is corrective discipline. This is the response when a problem arises, specifically when a member continues in unrepentant sin. This involves reprimands, and in the absolute worst-case scenarios, excommunication. But Dever's essay is adamant that the goal of corrective discipline is restoration. It is never meant to be a permanent exile. He quotes Proverbs saying, "Faithful are the wounds of a friend." Discipline is supposed to be a wake-up call.
And the text of Matthew 18 provides a highly practical, escalating three-step process for this wake-up call. It doesn't start with public shaming. Step 1 is entirely private. If your brother sins against you, you go and rebuke him in private, just the two of you. If he listens, the relationship is restored and the process stops there.
But if he refuses to listen, the text says you move to step 2. You take 1 or 2 others along with you. And the sources point out this is a direct callback to an ancient legal principle found in Deuteronomy 19.14, which states that every charge must be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses.
That requirement of witnesses is vital. It prevents discipline from devolving into a he said, she said scenario. It stops rumors and interpersonal vendettas from tearing the community apart because it forces the grievance to be objectively verified by outside parties.
And if the person still refuses to listen to the objective witnesses, step 3 is to tell it to the gathered church. If they refuse to listen even to the church, Jesus says to treat them as a Gentile and a tax collector. Now, based on Dever's essay and the study notes, what does it actually look like in practice?
In the context of the early church, treating someone as an outsider meant excluding them from the fellowship of the church, and specifically from communion, or the Lord's Supper. You were essentially interacting with them as an unbeliever. The theological hope is that by being placed outside the protective boundary of the community, they will realize the perilous spiritual state they're in and turn back.
I want you to really pause here and think about the gravity of what is being described. Excluding someone from a community is a massive, agonizing decision. And this is where we hit one of the most profound context shifts in the entire study. Because right after Jesus outlines this painful disciplinary process, he says, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he follows it up with a verse almost everyone knows. "For where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there among them."
What's fascinating here is we have all heard that verse quoted, usually at a small prayer meeting or a Bible study when attendance is a bit low. People will say, well, there's only a few of us here, but Jesus said where two or three are gathered, he is in our midst.
But looking at these study notes, that cozy interpretation completely ignores the surrounding text.
It is a widespread misinterpretation. Context dictates meaning. The context immediately preceding this verse is not a casual prayer meeting. It is the difficult, heartbreaking process of corrective church discipline.
So the two or three being mentioned are the two or three witnesses required in step 2 of the disciplinary process we just talked about.
Precisely. Jesus is not simply promising his omnipresence at small gatherings. He is guaranteeing his divine backing and authority when church leaders have to make the agonizingly difficult decision to discipline and potentially exclude an unrepentant member. He is telling the community, when you act in unity to address sin and protect the flock according to my word, I am right there in the middle of that decision, validating it.
That reframes the entire passage. It's a profound delegation of authority for the purity of the church. But giving human beings that kind of disciplinary authority sounds incredibly risky. Humans hold grudges. We are petty. Which is probably exactly why Peter steps up right after this heavy discussion and asks Jesus about the limits of forgiveness. He asks, "Lord, how many times till I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times.
To understand Peter's mindset, you have to understand the rabbinic traditions of the first century. The rabbis generally taught that a person was obligated to forgive someone 3 times for an offense. On the 4th offense, you were free to retaliate or withhold forgiveness.
So Peter takes the cultural standard of 3, doubles it, adds 1 for good measure, and lands on 7. He probably thinks he is demonstrating an incredibly, almost foolishly generous level of grace.
He certainly thinks he is stretching the bounds of mercy, but Jesus hits him with a reversal that shatters his entire framework. Jesus replies, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. Or as some translations render it, 70 times 7.
And the NAA notes point out a brilliant literary connection here that I'd completely missed.
The specific number, 70 times 7, is not random. It intentionally echoes and inverts an ancient boast found way back in Genesis chapter 4. In that text, a man named Lamech arrogantly boasts that while Cain would be avenged 7 times, he, Lamech, would exact limitless vengeance on anyone who wronged him 77 times over.
So Jesus is taking Lamech's ancient formula for infinite, unrestrained vengeance, and he's flipping it into a mandate for infinite, unrestrained forgiveness within the community. But he doesn't just leave it as an abstract mathematical concept. He illustrates it with the parable of the unforgiving servant. And to really grasp the point he is making, we have to look closely at the economics of this story. Here's where it gets really interesting.
The economics are truly staggering when you break down the historical currency values provided in the sources.
Let's do the math on this for you. Jesus describes a servant who was brought before a king, owing him 10,000 talents. A talent was the highest unit of currency in the ancient world, and 10,000 was the highest number used in Greek arithmetic. The sources give us the modern conversion. 10,000 talents is equal to 60 million denarii. Now, a denarius was roughly a day's wage for a common laborer. In today's money, that translates to roughly $6 billion US.
To put the absurdity of that number in perspective, that single debt was more money than was currently circulating in the entire economy of Palestine at the time. It is an infinitely unpayable sum. A laborer could work for thousands of lifetimes and never make a dent in it. Theologically, it represents the astronomical, unpayable debt of humanity's sin against a holy God.
And yet when the servant falls to his knees and begs for patience, the king doesn't just give him a payment plan. The text says the king is moved with deep compassion and cancels the entire debt, wipes out $6 billion with a single word. It is an act of unfathomable grace. But then the story takes a dark turn. That exact same servant walks out, finds a fellow servant who owes him 100 denarii, and starts literally choking him, demanding payment.
Let's look at that second debt. 100 denarii. That is 100 days of work for a laborer. The sources equate to about 3 months' wages, or roughly $12,000 US today.
Which is a real debt. Losing $12,000 is a significant blow. It hurts.
It does hurt. But compared to $6 billion, It is completely insignificant. It is an entirely manageable payable debt. Yet the newly forgiven servant refuses to show any mercy and throws his fellow servant into a debtor's prison over it.
The contrast Jesus is drawing here highlights the grotesque absurdity of a believer withholding forgiveness from someone else. The study notes make the central theological point clear, because the massive debt of our own sin couldn't possibly be paid by our own efforts and yet was freely forgiven by God's grace. Holding on to the comparatively petty debts of others proves we haven't actually understood or been transformed by that grace.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the parable ends terribly for the unforgiving servant. When the king discovers what has happened, he is furious. He hands the servant over to the torturers until he can pay back all he owes. And since we have already established that the debt of 10,000 talents is mathematically unpayable, the notes explain that the torturers here symbolize eternal punishment. The unforgiving servant faces absolute ruin.
Jesus ends the entire discourse with a chilling summary statement. "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart." I want to zero in on that phrase, "from your heart," because the NAA notes emphasize that it carries a specific biblical weight.
In ancient scriptural terms, the heart is not just the seat of fleeting romantic feelings as we often view it today. The heart is the very center of human emotion, intellect, and will. It is the core of existence. So when Jesus says you must forgive from the heart, he is saying that true forgiveness requires a total internal transformation of your will. It cannot be mere lip service or superficial truce.
So, what does this all mean for you? Let's synthesize the blueprint we've uncovered in the sources today. Jesus' vision for community is radically different from anything the world builds. We have seen that true greatness requires the absolute vulnerable humility of a child. We have seen that a healthy community requires the active, sometimes incredibly painful rescue of the lost through objective discipline and accountability. And finally, we have seen that God's staggering infinite mercy toward us demands our unlimited forgiveness toward others.
It is a cohesive, inseparable vision. You cannot sustain the community without the humility, you cannot practice the discipline without deep love, and you cannot experience the grace without extending the forgiveness. They all hold each other up.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. It builds perfectly on everything we've pulled from these Study Bibles and Dever's essay. If forgiving from the heart means transforming the very center of our emotions and will, as the sources state, could it be that holding on to a grudge is actually a form of self-imposed spiritual torture? Are we chaining ourselves to a prison that we already hold the key to open? Something to chew on as you navigate your relationships this week.
It is a heavy question, but an essential one. It reminds us that grace isn't just a transaction we receive, it is the very environment we are called to live and operate in.
That brings us to the end of our time together today. Thank you for taking this journey with us into the upside-down kingdom. God blesses all the listeners.